Happiness depends upon ourselves. Those words, written over 2000 years ago, still echo through time with a truth we desperately need today. But what if I told you that most of us have completely misunderstood what happiness actually is? What if our modern obsession with feeling good is the very thing preventing us from experiencing true fulfillment? Today we are diving into something that's been on my mind lately. This idea that happiness is something we should chase, something we should feel constantly. It's an idea that's absolutely everywhere in our culture, but it's also one that an ancient Greek philosopher would tell you is fundamentally flawed. We are going to explore why Aristotle would look at our modern pursuit of joy and shake his head. Not because joy is bad ultimately, but because we have confused the symptom for the cure. We have mistaken the byproduct for the goal. And in doing so, we may have lost our way in the world. Aristotle wasn't just some dusty academic. In ancient Athens, philosophy wasn't relegated to ivory towers. It was a practical discipline meant to be lived. That's also why ancient philosophy is relevant to this day. These philosophers weren't playing around with abstract ideas just for fun. Well, maybe some of them. But they were confidently tackling the most fundamental questions of human existence. What I find remarkable about the ancient Greek philosophers is how boldly and confidently they approached these big questions. There was no hesitation, no, well, that's just my opinion, disclaimers. When Aristotle wrote about happiness, he wrote with the unwavering certainty of someone who had genuinely figured something out. In his work, Nicomachean Ethics, which was essentially a series of lectures compiled by his son Nicomachus, hence the name, Aristotle dives deep into what it means to live well. And at the center of his ethics is the concept called EUDAIMONIA. Now we often translate EUDAIMONIA as happiness, but that's actually a terrible translation because our modern notion of happiness is so different from what Aristotle meant. Eudaimonia isn't a feeling or an emotional state, it's a way of being. It's about flourishing as a human, living in accordance with virtue and excellence. Here's what Aristotle himself says in the Nicomachean Ethics. The good of man is a working of the soul in the way of excellence in a complete life. For us it's not one swallow or one fine day that makes a spring. So it's not one day or a short time that makes a man blessed and happy. And I simply love that quote because it shows how Aristotle understands something that we often forget. That true fulfillment isn't a momentary thing. It's not about feeling good for a day, an hour, or even a year. It's about living a complete life of excellence. But what does actually excellence mean here? For Aristotle, it meant developing and practicing virtues, qualities like courage, temperance, justice, and wisdom. These aren't just abstract concepts, but practical skills that need to be developed through habit and practice. Just think about how different this is from our modern conception of happiness. We tend to think of happiness as a feeling, something we experience when things go our way or when we get what we want. It's fleeting, transient, dependent on circumstances. Aristotle would find this notion not just incomplete, but actually dangerous. Because when we make feeling good our aim, we become slaves to our own emotions. We chase pleasure and avoid pain at all costs, which ironically leads us further away from the balanced, virtuous life that would bring us true fulfillment. Now, it's worth noting that not everyone in ancient Greece agreed with Aristotle. There was another school of thought gaining popularity around the same time, and it's hedonism. The Epicureans, for example, followers of the philosopher Epicurus, believed that pleasure was the highest good and that the purpose of life was to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. In many ways, our modern culture has embraced a kind of neo-hedonism, the pursuit of pleasure as life's ultimate goal. But even Epicurus himself would be horrified by how we have interpreted his philosophy. He wasn't advocating for mindless indulgence. Rather, he encouraged simple pleasures and cautioned against the pursuit of excess, which he believed led to pain in the long run. Still, the fundamental difference between Aristotle and the hedonists remains. Is life about feeling good, or is it about being good? This is where our modern culture, I believe, often gets it wrong. We have been sold the idea that happiness is about maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. We measure our lives by how good we feel day to day. We chase dopamine hits through social media, consumption, entertainment, anything to keep the good feelings flowing. But listen to what Aristotle says in Book 1 of Nicomachean Ethics. The many, the most vulgar, seemingly conceive the good and happiness as pleasure, and hence they also like the life of gratification. Here they appear completely slavish, since the life they decide on is a life for grazing animals. Harsh words, plenty of confidence, but they are worth sitting with. Aristotle is suggesting that a life dedicated primarily to the pursuit of pleasure is a life unworthy of human potential. It's a life more suited to animals than to thinking, reasoning beings, capable of virtue and excellence. Alrighty, let me ask you something. Have you ever achieved something you had been wanting for a long time? Maybe a promotion, a relationship, a material possession, only to find that happiness it brought was far more temporary than you expected. This phenomenon is called hedonic adaptation, but Aristotle understood it thousands of years before psychologists gave it a name. We humans quickly adapt to new circumstances, whether good or bad, and return to a baseline level of happiness. And this is precisely why chasing joy as end goal is so problematic. It's like trying to catch smoke with your hands. The harder you grasp, the more it slips through your fingers. And I actually experienced this myself. Years ago, I was fixated on reaching certain professional milestones, convinced that they would bring me lasting fulfillment. And each time I achieved one of these goals, there was a rush of satisfaction, but it never lasted. After a few days or weeks, I found myself right back where I started, looking for the next thing to make me happy, like an addict. It was exhausting and ultimately hollow. What I've come to understand, what Aristotle knew all along, is that emotions are signals, not destinations. Joy isn't something to be pursued directly. Rather, it emerges naturally when we live in alignment with deeper values and virtues. Aristotle explains in Book 10 of Nicomachean Ethics. Pleasure completes the activity, not as the corresponding permanent state does, but its immanence, but as an end which supervenes, as the bloom of youth does on those in the flower of their age. So, in other words, pleasure or joy is like the bloom on a flower. It's beautiful, but it's not the purpose of the plant. It's a byproduct of health and proper development. The plant doesn't grow in order to bloom. The bloom happens when the plant is growing well. So if chasing joy directly isn't the answer, what is? How do we find this eudaimonia that Aristotle speaks of? The answer lies in understanding what it means to live virtuously, to develop excellence of character through deliberate practice and habit formation. Aristotle believed that virtues were means between extremes, the famous golden mean. Courage, for instance, is the middle ground between rashness and cowardice. Generosity is the mean between wastefulness and stinginess. In the Nicomachean Ethics, he writes, "Virtues, then, is a state of character concerned with choice, lying in a mean, the mean relative to us, this being determined by a rational principle, and by that principle by which the man of practical wisdom would determine it." What's fascinating about this approach is how practical it is. Virtue isn't abstract ideal, it's a habitual way of responding to life's challenges with wisdom and balance. It's about developing a character that naturally responds to situations in ways that promote human flourishing. And here's where things get interesting. According to Aristotle, when we live virtuously, positive emotions naturally follow. Joy becomes not the goal, but the natural consequence of living well. I think about how revolutionary this idea still is today. We live in a culture that treats emotions as the ultimate authority. Follow your heart, we are told. Do what feels good. But Aristotle would suggest that this gets things exactly backward. Our emotions should follow our virtues, not the other way around. This doesn't mean, of course, ignoring emotions or living some cold, calculated existence. Quite the opposite. Aristotle believed that the virtuous person would experience appropriate emotions at appropriate times. The difference is that these emotions would arise naturally from a well-ordered soul rather than being sought after directly. And one of the most counterculture aspects of Aristotle's philosophy is his emphasis on discipline over indulgence. We live in a world that celebrates indulgence, immediate gratification, convenience, comfort, and so on. But Aristotle understood that true fulfillment often requires the opposite: discipline, effort, even some degree of discomfort. In Book 2 of Nicomachean Ethics, he writes, "It's the nature of such things to be destroyed by defect and excess, as we see in the case of strength and of health. So too is it then in the case of temperance and courage and the other virtues. For the man who flies from and fears everything and does not stand his ground against anything becomes a coward. And the man who fears nothing at all, but goes to meet every danger, becomes rash." This passage highlights another crucial insight. Virtue requires balance. It's not about extreme self-denial or unrestrained indulgence, but about finding the appropriate middle ground. What would this look like in practice today? It might mean developing the courage to speak difficult truths when necessary, while having the restraint to know when silence is more virtuous. It might mean also enjoying pleasures without being controlled by them, or working diligently without becoming a workaholic. The key is that none of these virtues are pursued for the sake of feeling good in the moment. They're pursued because they constitute excellence of character, which leads to a flourishing life. And there's another aspect of Aristotle's philosophy that's particularly relevant today. He didn't see eudaimonia as a purely individual pursuit. In fact, he believed that humans are fundamentally social beings, and that true flourishing can only happen within the context of a community. In the Politics, another of his famous works, Aristotle famously declared that man is by nature a political animal, by which he meant that we naturally form communities and cannot fulfill our potential in isolation. I find this especially poignant in our increasingly atomized society. We have embraced an individualistic understanding of happiness. You do you, and whatever makes you happy. That would have been alien to Aristotle. For him, our virtues are developed and expressed in relation to others. Justice, generosity, friendliness, truthfulness, these all require other people. Even intellectual virtues, like wisdom, are cultivated through dialogue and shared inquiry. This communal dimension of eudaimonia challenges the modern notion that happiness is something we find or create for ourselves alone. According to Aristotle, a truly good life necessarily involves good relationships and contributing positively to one's community. So what would Aristotle tell us if he could see our world today? I think he would be fascinated by our technological progress, that's obvious, but concerned about our understanding of happiness. He might ask us, are you developing virtues or merely seeking pleasant experiences? Is your life guided by excellence of character or by the pursuit of comfort? Are you contributing to your community or primarily focused on your own pleasure? These aren't easy questions, but they are the kind that can reorient our understanding of what it means to live well. Right, I've been thinking about this a lot lately. What if instead of asking what will make me happy, we ask what kind of person do I want to become? What if instead of chasing fleeting emotions, we focused on developing virtues that lead to a flourishing life? I suspect we might find that joy comes not from direct pursuit, but as a byproduct of living with virtue and a purpose. That happiness isn't something we chase, but something that emerges when we live well. As Aristotle puts it in Book 1 of Nicomachean Ethics, the good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. Or if there are more kinds of virtue than one, in accordance with the best and most perfect kind. What's remarkable about this ancient wisdom is how fresh it feels, how applicable it remains to our modern lives, in a world constantly selling us happiness through consumption and distraction. Aristotle offers a profoundly different vision, one where fulfillment comes through character development, virtuous action, and contribution to your community. So here's what I hope you take away from this. Happiness isn't something to chase directly. It's not a feeling to be maximized or a state to be maintained constantly. Rather, it's the natural result of living a life of virtue and excellence. This doesn't mean you'll never feel sad or struggle. Even Aristotle acknowledged that external circumstances can affect our happiness. But he believed that a person of virtue could find meaning and fulfillment even amid difficulties. The question isn't then, how can I feel good all the time, but how can I develop the character that leads to a flourishing life? I would love to hear your thoughts on this. How do you understand happiness? Do you see it as something to pursue directly or as the byproduct of living well? Let me know in the comments below. And also, if you found this exploration of how brilliant ancient minds like Aristotle understood happiness interesting, you'll definitely want to catch my last video, where I dive in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, examining how even the most brilliant minds can sometimes rationalize terrible action. It's a fascinating look at how intelligence, when disconnected from virtue, can lead us astray. Okay, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, consider giving me a like and a subscription perhaps. Until next time, bye.